Hi, I'm Josh, and this is my heavy metal versus thrash metal comparison video. Last time I done death metal versus metalcore. I hope you like that video. If you haven't watched it, please go and check it out. Really helps me out. This video is going to be a bit similar to that one in terms of I do go through the history of the genre and then similarities, differences, and my thoughts at the end. It's going to be a similar, same sort of trend to that. So right, let's get into this video, starting off with the history of heavy metal. First developed in the late 60s and early 70s, the origins in the UK and the United States. The main influences for the creation of the genre include blues rock, psychedelic rock, acid rock, and classical music. Bands use this as a template for a heavier, thicker sound, which is part of the DNA of heavy metal. The main features of heavy metal include loud, distorted, high-gained guitars, emphatic rhythms, dense bass and drum sound, vigorous dynamic vocals, occasional keyboards and synths, palm-muted picking, blues, hard rock-inspired guitar riffs. Tunings varied. Some bands and guitarists experimented with obscure tunings in the 70s, but the main tunings were E standard, E flat, drop D. Lyrical themes include dealing with personal trauma, war, political, sex, and religion. Heavy metal was influenced by bands in the 60s experimenting with amp sound and chord progressions. Bands such as the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Who, Cream, the Yardbirds, Jimi Hendrix, breaking the mold and creating foundations for the original hard rock sound. This was the first step into creating the heavy metal sound that we all know. The earliest form of traditional heavy metal sound was created in the late 1960s with bands such as Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Fleetwood Mac early, Steppenwolf, and Blue Cheer the forefront of the genre's formation. Although saying that, there were a lot of other underground bands, too many to name right now, that were writing more extreme and progressive music at the time, and that was also considered a massive part of the creation of the heavy sound. In the 1970s, hard rock and early heavy metal bands emerged and became massively successful. Bands such as Blue Oyster Cult, Aerosmith, Kiss, Scorpions, AC/DC, Thin Lizzy, Queen, and Alice Cooper all being part of the next phase in the genre. However, it was in the early 80s where the genre properly came to be, with bands such as Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead, Saxon, Venom, and Diamond Head all breaking the mainstream in the wake of other popular genres at the time, including punk, pop, mainstream rock, and other stuff, and becoming the first generation of heavy metal bands. Other heavy metal bands that had great success in the 80s include Van Halen, Motley Crue, Wasp, Ozzy Osbourne, Dio, Guns N' Roses, Whitesnake, Queensryche, and Skid Row. Heavy metal over the last 40 years has submerged itself into multiple subgenres, too many over the years, so I'm just going to name the big main ones from each decade here. With thrash metal, which we'll come on to later, death metal, black metal, neoclassical metal, glam metal, also known as hair metal, doom metal, speed metal, and power metal emerged in the mid to late 80s. In the 90s, progressive metal, grunge, groove, death doom, alternative metal, industrial metal, and nu metal were all formed. In the 2000s, melodic death metal, technical death metal, blackened death metal, avant-garde, symphonic metal, metalcore, and deathcore were all created. And in the 2010s, we saw melodic metalcore and djent adding their names to the list of subgenres. Heavy metal as a genre is incredibly broad, with the scope of bands and influences dating back all the way to the 50s and the 60s, and then being given the true formula of the genre by 70s rock bands. Its influence and DNA has been scattered all over the heavy metal genre and some rock music as well. It's pretty much designed and created a whole new genre of music, a whole new way of life, a whole new culture. Every single metal band that came after the 80s were heavily influenced by heavy metal. With the genre officially dubbed 50 years old this year, massive respect and homage goes to the bands that influenced heavy metal and the early pioneers of heavy metal as well. Bands that exist today because of heavy metal include Metallica, Slayer, Death, Immortal, Behemoth, Merciful Fate, Marilyn Manson, Korn, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, Sun O, Avenged Sevenfold, Alter Bridge, Stone Sour, and too many more to name because it's pretty much every band that has existed. Now we're going to do a brief history of thrash metal. It first came to be in the early 1980s, with the origin being in the United States. It mixes the complexity of heavy metal music and the aggression and speed of hardcore punk and speed metal. It takes massive influence from 70s hard rock bands and early heavy metal bands such as the bands I've just mentioned. Also, most thrash bands take a heavy influence of punk rock bands such as Sex Pistols, Ramones, Killing Joke, Anti-Nowhere League and Stiff Little Fingers, and hardcore punk bands such as Misfits, Discharge and Dead Kennedys. Traits include fast tempos, heavily distorted guitars and bass guitars, usually tuned to E standard, E flat and drop D, complex guitar riffs, double bass drum, dynamic punk-like vocals, palm muting, chromatic chord progressions, time signature changes, advanced guitar solo techniques, and lyrics often are about war, politics, anarchy, being outcasted, religion, murder, and suicide. Thrash metal was a movement that developed as a backlash towards the more mainstream glam metal scene. Early thrash bands used this as a motivation to be better than them bands. They wanted to be personified as the complete opposite to what that genre is. The pioneers of thrash metal include Metallica with their albums Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets, Megadeth with Peace Sells, Slayer with Hell Awaits and Rain in Blood, and Anthrax with Spreading the Disease Among the Living. These are specifically known as the Big Four of thrash. Overkill, Exodus, Death Angel and Testament make up the Big Eight that dominated the scene in the 80s. These bands influenced a whole new wave of thrash metal in Europe, with Sodom, Creator, Acid Rain and Onslaught leading the way. Other notable bands that were successful in the 80s include Anvil, Annihilator, Sepultura, their early stuff, Sacred Reich, Flotsam and Jetsam, Nuclear Assault, Heathen, Dark Angel and Violence. In the early 90s, band continued to produce some great thrash metal albums with Rust in Peace, Persistence of Time, Seasons in the Abyss and Souls of Black, Horoscope and Coma of Souls. However, in 1991, when Metallica released their commercially massive album, the Black Album, also self-titled album, this changed the face of thrash metal for the rest of the decade. Some bands decided to join Metallica in changing their sound to a more traditional heavy metal sound, or an extreme metal sound, or a commercial rock sound to kind of stay relevant. Anthrax changed to an alternative metal sound, and Slayer chose a groove and a new metal sound. Testament made their own Black Album in The Ritual and then went down a more extreme death metal, black metal sort of path. And other bands, including Exodus, Dark Angel and Death Angel, disbanded completely and became inactive for the 90s and the early 2000s. Although in the mid 2000s, all these bands come back together and created the thrash revival. The Big Four and other bands who changed their style in the 90s returned to their roots and made some really good thrash metal albums, with Death Magnetic for Metallica, United Abominations and Endgame for Megadeth, Well Painted Blood for Slayer, Violent Revolution for Creator, Shovel-Headed Kill Machine and Atrocity Exhibition for Exodus, Ironbound for Overkill, and Worship Music for Anthrax. Also in the 2010s, more successful albums by Testament and Death Angel, and also the Big Four again, all creating some really good thrash albums. Also, there was a resurgence of new thrash metal bands in the 2000s, including Power Trip, Evil, Toxic Holocaust, Warbringer, Gamma Bomb, Multiple Waste, Violator, and Havoc. There were a few subgenres that were created due to thrash metal. The biggest one was crossover thrash. This is a fusion between thrash metal and hardcore punk. It's more metal version of punk and uses thrash tempos, chord progressions, and punk vocal style and song structure. Bands of this genre include Suicidal Tendencies, Stormtroopers of Death, Dirty Rotten Imbeciles, and Corrosion of Conformity. Other subgenres of thrash metal include blackened thrash, death thrash, and thrashcore, which cannot be mistaken with crossover thrash. It's basically a faster version of punk, which uses elements of hardcore. It's kind of where they get the thrash part from. The influence and legacy of thrash metal music has had a huge impact on metal genre as a whole, influencing the vast majority of the genres that preceded it, including death metal, black metal, groove metal, grindcore, metalcore, and deathcore, all using elements of thrash in their music. What the bands did in the early 80s and what they went through, barely getting past the days at the time, to rise up and become rock stars and massive metal pioneers, and it just cannot go without saying what they did back then. They defined the genre and took it to places no one thought possible at the time. Nowadays, thrash has never been stronger. There's so many bands being influenced by the genre, and most of the old guard still going today have never been in a better place than they are right now, which I think is great. Bands that have been massively influenced by thrash metal include Possessed, Obituary, Morbid Angel, Celtic Frost, Mayhem, Emperor, Pantera, Machine Head, White Zombie, Five Finger Death Punch, Lamb of God, Trivium, Bullet for My Valentine, and so many more across all the genres. Right, so we're going to do the similarities now. They both share the same influences. Hard rock bands from the 70s, they all used to listen to that back in the day. Thrash metal is influenced by heavy metal, albeit it's a much faster version of heavy metal, but it was still influenced by it, so yeah. They are both stylistically similar. They have similar riffs and technical guitar solos and a similar sort of sound. Some thrash bands in the 90s developed more of a heavy metal sound as well, so then some of them are more considered heavy metal than thrash. They both use the same tunings, E, E flat and drop D, and they both have a similar massive influence on the genre as a whole, because they're pretty much the earliest forms of both genres, of the genre of metal. The difference is now the tempo and the time signature changes are different. There isn't so many fast high tempos in heavy metal than there is in thrash, and also time signature changes as well, and all that not as apparent in heavy metal than it is in thrash. The solos are much faster in thrash, obviously because the tempos are faster, and yeah, that's where we get shred from, which is cool. Thrash has a massive punk influence, whereas heavy metal bands didn't really see punk as an influence. They more saw them as a rival in terms of the mainstream vibe back in the day. The vocal styles are pretty different. Thrash metal have more of a abrupt sort of punk vibe to their vocals, really in your face and straight to the point, whereas heavy metal vocals are lean towards more of a rock vibe than a punk vibe. So yeah. Higher complex guitar riffs and drum patterns in thrash metal. Yeah, they're a bit more quicker, the tempo's a bit quicker, and double bass drum and blast beats rather than, you know, just a simple rock based kind of drum beat. But also for the guitar riffs, much faster, much more stuff going on rather than in heavy metal. And the guitars and the bass are way more distorted in thrash than heavy metal. That's because they use more distortion, more gain than heavy metal. So yeah. Right, moving on to my final thoughts. Both genres are really similar, but also have their differences as well. I personally like heavy metal as a whole, obviously because I'm a metalhead. But the early heavy metal and hard rock bands from the 70s and 80s, I love to listen to their music. I don't listen to all their music, but what I do, I think it's really, really cool. Really cool. The influence and legacy of those bands created over the last 50 years, simply incredible to me. They formed the DNA for the genre, and everyone else who came after took it and made it their own. That's what's so special and brilliant about this genre. There's an established DNA that everyone follows, but the scope and style is so broad and diverse, it creates something only metal music can do, which is awesome, and that's exactly why we love it. And I absolutely love thrash metal. It's one of my favourite genres of metal. The speed and ferocity got me hooked as a teenager. The aggression and tempo was exactly what I needed at the time. Also, the trials and tribulations what the early days of thrash went through, it's really inspiring for me. You know, they were living in old beat up apartments, couldn't afford anything, a decent accommodation. They used to stay in places where they just have their gear piled up in one corner, and then they'd just sleep on the floor. Sometimes they would even go without food. You know, this fueled them to give them, you know, this give them the drive and the determination to become really successful and define the generation in the 80s and the 90s. Now the genre has never been so big, and it's all because of them. Without thrash and heavy metal, we wouldn't have modern metal like we have today. So massive respect, massive respect goes to them. Right, so that's been this video, going through thrash and heavy metal. What's your favourite genre out of the two, or do you like both? Let me know. All feedback on this video is much appreciated, because this is only the second one, and I want to see how it goes, see if how I can make it better and all that. If you liked, put a like on this video if you liked it. If you're new, please subscribe and check out the playlist of all the other content and the previous video. I'm not sure when the next one will be, but keep out for it. And till next time, keep it metal.